beneath the shifting sands of a timeless desert, where whispers of ancient empires still linger in the wind, a young dreamer named Kael stumbles upon something extraordinary, a shard of the celestial mirror, its surface glimmering with the faint echoes of forgotten kingdoms. As his fingers brush against the relic, a rush of visions overtakes him, crumbling palaces, shadowed figures, and a darkness that seems to stretch across the ages. But this is no ordinary artifact. It holds the dreams of those who once ruled these lands, dreams that now call to Kael with a sense of urgency he can't ignore. Yet, as the relic pulses with an eerie light, something stirs in the distance. The sand wraiths, guardians of the desert's deepest secrets, have sensed its power, and they will stop at nothing to reclaim it. Tonight, we follow Kael as he embarks on a journey, not just across the mystic sands, but into the very heart of a mystery that could reshape the fate of an ancient world. What lies hidden in these dreams of empires long lost, and what price will Kael pay to uncover the truth? Kael stumbled through the crumbling archway of the ancient temple, his breath ragged and his heart pounding. The once majestic structure, now a shadow of its former glory, stood as a silent witness to the empires that had risen and fallen under the mystic sands. Its walls, etched with faded symbols and worn carvings, seemed to hum faintly with the whispers of forgotten ages. Desperation clung to him like the dust on his cloak, but there was no time to dwell on the past. The sand wraiths were closing in. As he stepped deeper into the temple's shadowed halls, a figure emerged from the dim light. Lyra, cloaked in robes the color of sun-bleached parchment, stood before him. Her piercing gaze held the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime deciphering the secrets of the desert. "You've brought them here," she said, her voice calm but edged with urgency. "The wraiths will not rest until the celestial mirror is back in their grasp, or destroyed." Kael's hand instinctively went to the satchel at his side, where the artifact rested. He had risked everything to steal it, believing it was the key to uncovering the truth about the ancient empires. But now, faced with Lyra's warning, doubt crept in. Could this relic truly be worth the danger it had unleashed? Lyra stepped closer, her expression softening. "I've spent years studying the lore of these sands," she said. "The mirror is not just a tool, it's a symbol of power, one that could reshape the fate of these lands, but it comes with a price. The wraiths were born from the empire's downfall, and they will stop at nothing to ensure their dominion over the sands." Kael's mind raced. Trusting a stranger in this desolate place was a gamble, but so was going it alone. Before he could respond, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A low rumble echoed through the temple, and the air grew thick with the sound of shifting sands. Lyra's eyes widened. "They're here," she whispered. "The wraiths have found us." The walls seemed to close in as the tremors grew stronger. Kael glanced at Lyra, then back at the satchel. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like the stones above. To trust her meant sharing the burden of the mirror's power and its curse, but to go alone meant facing the wraiths with no ally, no guide, and no hope of understanding the artifact's true purpose. As the temple groaned and the shadows deepened, Kael knew that whatever choice he made would shape not only his fate, but the destiny of the mystic sands themselves. The air was thick with dust as Kael and Lyra stumbled out of the crumbling temple, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. Behind them, the ancient stones groaned and crashed, sealing the entrance they had just fled. But the danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. The eerie whispers of the sand wraiths echoed through the dunes, their ghostly forms shimmering in the distance, relentless in their pursuit. Lyra turned to Kael, her eyes sharp with urgency, and revealed the truth they both needed to face. The relic they carried was only a fragment of something far greater. To unlock its true power, they would need to find the other shards, scattered across the vast and unforgiving desert. Kael hesitated for only a moment. The visions of the ancient kingdom still haunted him, its grandeur, its downfall, and the weight of a legacy he didn't yet fully understand. But deep within him, a spark of resolve ignited. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger, something that called to him in ways he couldn't ignore. With a nod, he agreed to join Lyra on this perilous quest, his sense of responsibility growing stronger with each passing moment. As they ventured deeper into the desert, the landscape shifted around them, endless waves of gold and amber, dotted with jagged rock formations and the occasional skeletal remains of long-forgotten travelers. The sun blazed overhead, relentless and unforgiving, but the real challenge lay ahead. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon a caravan of traders, their colorful tents and bustling activity a stark contrast to the desolation of the dunes. The traders welcomed them with wary smiles, offering water and shade, but their warnings came quickly. The cursed oasis, they said, was no place for the unprepared. It was a place of beauty and terror, where the water shimmered like liquid silver, but hid something far darker. Whispers of vanished travelers and strange, otherworldly lights surrounded the oasis, and many who sought its treasures never returned. Yet it was there, the traders claimed, that one of the shards lay hidden, protected by forces no one fully understood. Kael listened intently, his determination unwavering. The warnings only fueled his resolve. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger, but the memory of the ancient kingdom and the weight of the relic in his hand left him no choice. With Lyra by his side, he steeled himself for the trials to come. The cursed oasis awaited, and with it, the next step in a journey that would test not only their courage, but their very understanding of the world they thought they knew. As Kael and Lyra stepped into the cursed oasis, the air grew heavy, thick with an otherworldly energy that seemed to whisper warnings in their ears. The once serene landscape twisted before their eyes, transforming into a shifting maze of illusions designed to test the very core of their being. Kael froze as the ground beneath him cracked, revealing a vision that struck him to his soul, his village, engulfed in flames, the screams of his people echoing in his ears. The guardian spirit of the oasis had conjured his deepest fears, forcing him to confront the possibility of losing everything he held dear. His heart raced, but he clenched his fists, reminding himself of the greater mission. "This isn't real," he whispered, his voice trembling yet resolute. "I won't let fear stop me." With each step forward, the illusions faded, but the weight of what he had seen lingered, fueling his determination to protect the ancient empires from a similar fate. Meanwhile, Lyra found herself standing in the ruins of a forgotten temple, the air thick with the scent of ash and regret. Before her stood a shadowy figure, herself, but from another time. This version of Lyra bore the weight of a failure she had tried to bury, a moment when her hesitation had cost lives. The guardian spirit had unearthed her guilt, forcing her to face it head-on. "You could have saved them," the shadow whispered, its voice a haunting echo of her own. Tears welled in her eyes, but she straightened her back, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I can't change the past," she said, "but I won't let it define me." The shadow dissolved, leaving her standing taller, her resolve hardened by the trial. Together, Kael and Lira emerged from their personal battles, their bond stronger than ever. The guardian spirit, a shimmering figure of shifting sands and golden light, appeared before them. "You have faced your fears and embraced your truths," it intoned, its voice both ancient and wise. "For this, you are worthy." With a wave of its hand, the second shard of the mystic sands appeared, glowing with an inner light that seemed to pulse in time with their heartbeats. But just as they reached for it, the ground trembled and the air grew cold. The sand wraiths had found them. The wraiths materialized from the dunes, their hollow eyes fixed on the shard, their forms writhing like smoke and sand. Kael and Lyra exchanged a glance, wordlessly agreeing on their next move. There was no time to celebrate their victory. With the shard clutched tightly, they turned and ran, the wraiths close behind. The Oasis, once a place of trial, now became a battleground, its illusions fading into the chaos of their desperate escape. As they fled, Lyra glanced over her shoulder, her voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "We're not done yet," she said, her tone fierce. "This is just the beginning." And with that, they vanished into the desert, the second shard in hand, their journey far from over. The journey to the City of Whispers was anything but ordinary. Kael and Lyra, now with 2 shards in their possession, found themselves descending into a canyon so vast and shadowed that it seemed to swallow the very light of the sun. Carved into the rock walls was a city, unlike any they had ever seen, a labyrinth of tiered streets, hanging gardens, and lanterns that flickered like distant stars. This was the City of Whispers, a place where secrets seemed to linger in the air, carried on the faintest breeze. At its heart stood the palace of Sultana Neha, a figure shrouded in mystery. Her court was a spectacle of opulence, with silken banners cascading from the ceilings and jeweled mosaics that caught the light in dazzling patterns. Yet beneath the grandeur, there was an undercurrent of tension. Neha's gaze was sharp, her words measured, as she offered Kael and Lira sanctuary within her walls. But her offer came with a price, the shards they carried. Lyra's instincts screamed caution. She had seen too many rulers use their power to manipulate and deceive. "We can't trust her," she whispered to Kael, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the court. But Kael, ever the optimist, saw an opportunity. Neha promised safety, a reprieve from the relentless pursuit they had faced. Her words were smooth, her arguments persuasive, and in that moment, the weight of their journey seemed to press down on him, making the idea of respite all too tempting. Reluctantly, they agreed to her terms. As Kael handed over the shards, his eyes drifted to Neha's throne. There, etched into the golden frame, was a symbol that sent a chill through him. It was unmistakable, a match to the markings on the ancient relic they had been tasked to protect. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind. What did Neha know about the relic? Why did she want the shards so badly? Lyra's warnings echoed in his thoughts, but it was too late. The shards were in Neha's hands, and her smile was as enigmatic as the city she ruled. Kael couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stepped into a game far more dangerous than they realized. The City of Whispers had earned its name, and now its secrets were beginning to unravel. As Kael and Lira ventured deeper into the hidden passage beneath the city, the air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of aged stone and forgotten secrets. The flickering light of their torches danced across the walls, revealing intricate carvings of a time long past figures, cloaked in celestial robes, mirrors reflecting stars, and shadowy forms that seemed to writhe in the stone. It was as if the walls themselves whispered fragments of a story neither of them fully understood. At last, they stepped into a vast underground chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness, and its floor lined with rows of ancient scrolls, their edges brittle and yellowed with age. Lyra's eyes widened as she reached for one of the scrolls, unrolling it carefully. The symbols and illustrations seemed to come alive under her touch, telling a tale of chaos and hope. "Kael," she said softly, her voice echoing in the chamber. The celestial mirror wasn't just broken, it was shattered on purpose, to stop someone called the Shadow King. The name sent a chill through the air, as though speaking it aloud awakened something dormant in the shadows. Kael's heart sank as he pieced together the fragments of the story. The celestial mirror, once a beacon of unity and balance, had been destroyed to seal away the Shadow King's power. But now, as the world teetered on the edge of collapse, the only way to restore order was to reunite the shards. It was a cruel irony. The very act that could save their world might also unleash the greatest evil it had ever known. His mind raced, torn between the weight of responsibility and the gnawing fear of what could go wrong. "If we bring the shards together," he murmured, "we risk waking him. But if we don't," his voice trailed off as the visions of the crumbling kingdom flashed before his eyes once more. A world consumed by fire and ash, its people crying out for salvation. Lyra placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "There has to be another way," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. "What if we destroy the shards instead? Break them beyond repair. If the Shadow King's power is tied to the mirror, then destroying it might keep him sealed forever." Her words carried a glimmer of hope, a simpler solution to an impossible problem. But Kael couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't that simple. The scrolls spoke of balance, of forces that could not be destroyed, only transformed. And the visions, those relentless, haunting visions, seemed to pull him toward a different path. He could almost hear the whispers of the past urging him to continue, to finish what had been started centuries ago. "What if destroying the shards only makes things worse?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if the Shadow King's power is already stirring, and the mirror is the only thing that can stop him?" The chamber seemed to hold its breath as the two stood there, the weight of their choices pressing down on them. Kael's resolve wavered, caught between the fear of what he might unleash and the desperate hope of saving what remained of their world. Lyra's suggestion lingered in the air like a lifeline, But Kael couldn't ignore the pull of destiny, a path fraught with danger, yet one that felt undeniably his to walk. The ancient scrolls had shown them the truth, but now the decision lay in their hands, and time was running out. The desert wind howled like a mournful cry as Kael and Lira stepped beyond the crumbling gates of the City of Whispers. The air was thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm. Yet, the storm that came was not one of sand and sky, but of shadow and malice. From the dunes rose the sand wraiths, their forms shimmering like heat waves, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Ambush came swiftly, a whirlwind of chaos that left no room for strategy or thought. Kael shouted for Lyra, his voice swallowed by the cacophony of clashing blades and guttural cries. In the fray, he lost sight of her, and before he could react, a blow to the head sent him spiraling into darkness. When Kael awoke, the world was cold and silent. He found himself in a cavern, its walls slick with moisture, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. The faint glow of bioluminescent fungi cast eerie shadows, and as his vision adjusted, he saw them, the sand wraiths, their forms shifting like smoke. Their leader stepped forward, a figure cloaked in darkness, its voice a rasping whisper. "You are but a pawn in a game far greater than you know," it hissed. "The shards you seek are not relics of salvation. They are keys to the Shadow King's return, and you have delivered them into our hands." Kael's chest tightened as the words sank in. The shards he had been so desperate to find, the quest that had consumed him, it had all been a trap. The Shadow King, a name whispered only in the darkest legends, was stirring once more, and Kael had unknowingly played his part. Anger and guilt warred within him, but there was no time for despair. He had to escape, to find Lyra and warn her before the wraiths could complete their sinister plan. The cavern was vast, its tunnels winding and treacherous, but Kael's resolve burned brighter than the shadows that surrounded him. He would not let the desert's secrets claim him, not yet. Kael gripped the relic tightly, its ancient power pulsing through his veins like a river of fire. With a surge of energy, he channeled its force, shattering the cavern walls that had trapped him. But the effort came at a cost. As the dust settled, he collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The relic's power had drained him, leaving him vulnerable and disoriented. Stumbling through the barren landscape, Kael felt the weight of the desert sun pressing down on him. His steps grew slower, his vision blurring with fatigue. Just as he thought he could go no further, a group of figures appeared on the horizon. A nomadic tribe, their robes billowing in the wind. They approached him with cautious curiosity, and when they saw the state he was in, they offered him shelter without hesitation. Around the flickering light of their campfire, the tribe shared stories of their people. One tale, in particular, caught Kael's attention, a prophecy passed down through generations. It spoke of a dreamer, one who would wield the celestial mirror, an artifact of immense power. This dreamer, they said, would stand at the crossroads of destiny, their actions determining the fate of the world. The tribe's elder, a woman with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages, looked directly at Kael as she spoke. "The mirror chooses its bearer," she said, her voice steady and firm. "But the path it reveals is not always clear. It can lead to salvation or ruin." Her words struck a deep chord within Kael. Doubt crept into his mind, whispering fears he had tried to bury. Could he truly bear such a responsibility? Was he strong enough to wield the mirror without succumbing to its power? The elder seemed to sense his uncertainty. She placed a weathered hand on his shoulder and said, "The mirror does not choose lightly. Trust in your dreams, for they are the compass that will guide you." That night, as Kael rested beneath the stars, his dreams took him to a place both familiar and strange. He saw Lyra, her face etched with determination, wandering the endless dunes of the desert. She was searching for him, calling his name into the vast emptiness. The vision was so vivid, so real, that he woke with a start, his heart pounding. The connection he felt to her was undeniable, a bond that transcended distance and time. In that moment, Kael's resolve hardened. No matter the doubts that plagued him, no matter the weight of the prophecy, he knew he could not turn back. Lyra needed him, and their quest was far from over. As the first light of dawn painted the horizon, he rose to his feet, the Relic's power humming faintly at his side. The path ahead was uncertain, but he would face it with courage, guided by the dreams that had brought him this far. Kael's steps slowed as he approached the edge of the singing dunes, the air alive with an eerie, melodic hum that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath his feet. The horizon shimmered with golden waves of sand, each crest shifting and falling like a living thing. It was here, at the edge of this vast, undulating expanse, that he spotted Lyra waiting for him, her silhouette framed against the setting sun. Her expression was tense, but her eyes sparkled with determination. The third shard was close. They could both feel it, but so were the dangers. The singing dunes were no ordinary desert. The sands seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy, producing haunting tones that echoed in the wind. These sounds weren't just unsettling. They were disorienting, twisting the senses of anyone who dared to venture too deep. Kael felt it immediately. The melodies tugged at his thoughts, pulling him in conflicting directions. One moment, he was certain of their path. The next, he questioned every step. Lyra, too, seemed affected, her usually steady gaze flickering with uncertainty as she scanned the horizon. The dunes weren't just alive with sound, they were alive with movement. The sands shifted constantly, erasing footprints and reshaping the landscape in moments. It was as if the desert itself didn't want them to succeed. And then there were the sand wraiths. Shadowy figures that seemed to materialize from the grains themselves, their forms twisting and reforming as they closed in. The wraiths didn't attack, not yet. They lingered at the edges of Kael and Lyra's vision, silent and watchful, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they pressed forward, Kael began to hear something else beneath the dunes' haunting melodies. Whispers, faint at first, but growing clearer with every step. The words were indistinct, but their meaning was unmistakable. They spoke of doubt, of fear, of failure. "Turn back," the sands seemed to murmur. "You don't belong here. You'll never find what you seek." The whispers clawed at his resolve, planting seeds of uncertainty. Was this journey worth the cost? Could he truly succeed where so many others had failed? Lyra, sensing his unease, placed a hand on his shoulder. "The dunes are testing you," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "They feed on doubt. Don't let them win." Her words grounded him, but the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Kael realized then that this wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a test of the mind and spirit. The shard wasn't hidden in the sand, it was hidden within him. To find it, he would have to confront the doubts that had haunted him since the beginning of this quest. The sand wraiths drew closer, their forms shimmering like heat waves in the distance. Time was running out. Kael closed his eyes, shutting out the disorienting melodies and the whispers of the sand. He focused instead on the memory of why he had started this journey, the promise he had made, the hope he carried, and the people who depended on him. When he opened his eyes again, the whispers faded, drowned out by the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. The path ahead became clear, etched into the shifting sands like a beacon. The third shard was near, and nothing, not the wraiths, not the dunes, not even his own fears, would stop him now. Kael and Lyra stood before the towering stone obelisk, its surface weathered by centuries of unrelenting winds. At its base, glinting faintly in the sunlight, was the third shard, the final piece of the artifact they had risked so much to find. Kael reached out, his fingers brushing against the shard, and as he pulled it free, the ground beneath them trembled. The obelisk groaned, cracks spidering up its ancient surface, and suddenly, the air around them erupted into a swirling maelstrom of sand. The dunes themselves seemed to come alive, the storm swallowing the horizon. Before they could react, the sand wraiths emerged from the chaos, their ghostly forms cutting through the storm like blades. Kael grabbed Lyra's hand, and they ran, the collapsing obelisk sending shards of stone raining down around them. But the wraiths were faster, their eerie wails echoing as they closed in. In the chaos, Lyra stumbled, a sharp cry escaping her lips as one of the wraith's shadowy claws grazed her side. Kael didn't hesitate. He scooped her up, her weight pressing against him as he fought to keep moving, the storm howling in his ears. As they fled, Kael felt the burden of their mission pressing down on him like never before. Every step was a struggle, every breath a battle against the relentless sand and the pursuing wraiths. Yet, even in her pain, Lyra's voice reached him, steady and calm. "You've got this, Kael," she whispered, her faith in him unshaken. Her words cut through the chaos, a lifeline in the storm. They managed to escape the dunes, but the wraiths did not relent. Their eerie forms lingered at the edges of Kael's vision, a constant reminder that their fight was far from over. Kael knew they couldn't keep running forever. The shards they carried were a beacon, drawing the wraiths closer with every passing moment. But for now, they had to keep moving. Lyra's injury needed tending, and the weight of their quest, of protecting her, of fulfilling their destiny, only grew heavier with each step. The sands had tested them, but the true challenge still lay ahead. The air grew heavy with the scent of ancient stone and forgotten secrets, as Kael and Lyra stepped into the shadowed ruins of the fortress. The towering walls, cracked and weathered by centuries, seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as if the very stones remembered the empire they once protected. This place, they knew, was no ordinary refuge. It was a trial, a labyrinth of challenges left behind by those who had come before. Somewhere within these crumbling halls lay the fourth shard, the key to restoring balance to the mystic sands. But the path to it was far from straightforward. Spectral warriors, clad in armor that shimmered like moonlight, emerged from the darkness. Their eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and their voices echoed with the authority of a long-lost age. Only the worthy may pass, one intoned, its tone both commanding and distant. Kael felt the weight of their gaze, the unspoken demand to prove himself. This was no mere battle of strength. It was a test of mind and spirit, a challenge that would demand every ounce of his courage and wisdom. The first trial came in the form of riddles, cryptic words that seemed to twist and shift like the desert sands. Kael struggled at first, the pressure mounting as the warriors watched in silence. But Lyra, despite her injury, leaned against a broken pillar and whispered hints, her sharp mind piecing together the puzzles faster than Kael could. Together, they unraveled the riddles, each answer unlocking a step deeper into the fortress. Yet as they progressed, Lyra's strength waned. Her steps slowed, and Kael could see the pain etched across her face. He wanted to rush, to push forward, but he knew haste could cost them everything. The next trial was physical, a series of traps and obstacles that required agility and precision. Kael moved cautiously, his heart pounding as he navigated crumbling staircases and dodged falling debris. Lyra followed as best she could, but her injury forced them to pause more often than Kael would have liked. Every delay gnawed at him, a growing fear that they might not reach the shard in time. The fortress, as if sensing their struggle, seemed to grow more unstable. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. As they neared the heart of the fortress, the spectral warriors appeared once more, their forms flickering like flames. "You have shown courage and wisdom," one said, its voice softer now, almost approving. "But the final test lies ahead." The walls around them began to crack, the sound of stone grinding against stone filling the air. Time was running out. Kael and Lyra exchanged a glance, a silent agreement to push forward, no matter the cost. The shard was close. They could feel its pull, but the fortress was collapsing around them, each step more perilous than the last. In the distance, a faint light glimmered, the promise of their goal just within reach. But the path to it was crumbling, the floor giving way beneath their feet. Kael grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her forward as they leaped over gaps and dodged falling rubble. The air was thick with dust, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The shard was so close, yet the fortress seemed determined to keep it from them. And then, with a deafening roar, the ceiling above them began to collapse. They had no choice but to run, their fate hanging in the balance as the ancient fortress crumbled around them. The weight of the fourth shard pressed heavily against Kael's chest as he and Lyra stood at the edge of the desert, gazing toward the jagged silhouette of the black Mesa on the horizon. The air was thick with unease, and the whispers of the wind seemed to carry warnings of the dangers ahead. It was there, deep within the Mesa's shadowed heart, that the final shard awaited the last piece of the artifact that could either save their world or unleash its destruction. But the path to the Shadow King's tomb was no ordinary journey. It was a gauntlet of peril, guarded by the Wraiths, spectral sentinels who thrived in darkness and fed on fear. Kael's resolve wavered as the reality of what lay ahead settled over him. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, but the weapon felt heavier than usual, as if it too sensed the gravity of the task. "Maybe we've come far enough," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. "What if this is where we draw the line? What if we're walking into a trap we can't escape?" Lyra turned to him, her piercing green eyes steady despite the tension in the air. The prophecy didn't promise an easy path. She reminded him, her tone firm, but not unkind. Every step we've taken has led us here. The lives of countless others depend on us, on you. To see this through, the Shadow King's return would mean the end of everything we know. We can't turn back now. Her words struck a chord, but they did little to silence the doubts gnawing at Kael's mind. As they pressed onward, the landscape grew darker, the sun hidden behind a veil of ash and shadow. The Black Mesa loomed larger with each passing hour, its jagged peaks cutting into the sky like the teeth of some ancient beast. And with every step closer, Kael's nightmares grew more vivid. In his restless sleep, he saw the Shadow King rising from his tomb, his form a swirling mass of darkness and malice. The king's voice echoed in Kael's mind, taunting him, questioning his worth. "Do you truly believe you can stop me?" the shadow hissed. "A mere mortal, trembling at the edge of destiny. You are no hero. You are nothing." Kael woke in a cold sweat, the echoes of the Shadow King's laughter still ringing in his ears. He glanced at Lyra, who was keeping watch by the fire, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to ask what troubled him. The haunted look in his eyes told her enough. "We all carry doubts," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. "But it's not the absence of fear that defines us. It's what we do in spite of it." "You're stronger than you think, Kael, and you're not alone." Her words were a lifeline, but Kael couldn't shake the feeling that the Mesa was more than just a physical challenge. It was a test of his spirit, a crucible that would either forge him into the hero he needed to be, or break him entirely. As they approached the base of the Mesa, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around them. The Wraiths were close. He could feel their presence, like a chill creeping up his spine. Yet, even as fear tightened its grip, Kael took a deep breath and tightened his hold on the shard. He glanced at Lyra, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Together, they stepped into the shadow of the Black Mesa, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The final shard was within reach, but so too was the darkness that threatened to consume them both. At the base of the Black Mesa, the air grew heavy with tension as Kael and Lyra approached a ragtag group of rebels huddled around a flickering fire. These were no ordinary warriors. They were survivors of a generation's long struggle against the relentless sand wraiths. Their faces bore the marks of countless battles, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of defiance and weariness. The rebels offered an alliance, promising to guide Kael and Lyra to the ancient tomb hidden within the Mesa. But even as the words left their leader's lips, Kael felt a ripple of unease. Something about their eagerness didn't sit right with him. Lyra, ever the voice of reason, leaned in close. "We don't know them," she whispered, her tone cautious. "Trust is a luxury we can't afford right now." But Kael couldn't ignore the fire in the rebels' eyes. Their determination mirrored his own. They had fought the Wraiths for years, and their knowledge of the terrain could be invaluable. Against Lyra's better judgment, Kael agreed to join forces, though the weight of his decision lingered like a shadow. As they began their ascent up the jagged slopes of the Mesa, the rebels proved their worth. They moved with the precision of those who knew every crevice and crag, guiding Kael and Lyra through hidden paths that avoided the Wraiths' patrols. But the calm didn't last. Midway up the mesa, a deafening roar shattered the silence. The wraiths descended in a storm of sand and fury, their spectral forms twisting through the air like living nightmares. In the chaos, Kael noticed something that sent a chill through his veins. The rebels' leader, a man named Varrock, lingered at the edge of the fray, his movements oddly deliberate. When a wraith's blade narrowly missed Kael, he caught a glimpse of Varrock's face, not fear, but a cold, calculating smirk. The pieces fell into place. Varrock wasn't just fighting the wraiths, he was working with them. The betrayal struck like a thunderbolt. Kael's trust had been a weapon turned against him, and now their mission hung by a thread. Lyra's earlier warning echoed in his mind, a bitter reminder of the stakes. As the wraiths closed in, Kael knew he had to act fast before the Mesa became their tomb. The air was thick with tension as Kael and Lyra pressed forward, their breaths ragged, their bodies battered but unyielding. The wraiths swarmed around them, their ghostly forms flickering like shadows cast by a dying flame. Each step was a battle, each swing of their blades a desperate attempt to carve a path through the relentless horde. The Mesa's jagged cliffs loomed above them, the terrain itself seeming to conspire against their progress. Yet amidst the chaos, Kael's relic pulsed with a steady, growing light, a beacon cutting through the darkness, guiding them toward their destination. As they fought their way closer to the tomb, the relic's glow intensified, casting an eerie light across the barren landscape. It was as if the artifact itself sensed the weight of what lay ahead. And then, in a moment of eerie stillness, Kael froze. Before him stood the Shadow King, not in flesh, but in a vision so vivid it felt real. The figure's eyes burned with a cold, calculating fire, and his voice echoed in Kael's mind like a distant thunderstorm. "The Shards," the Shadow King said, his tone both commanding and seductive. "Give them to me, and I will grant you the power to end this war. No more bloodshed. No more loss, just peace." Kael's heart raced. The offer was tempting, achingly so. How many lives could be saved? How much suffering could be avoided? For a fleeting moment, he considered it, the weight of the relic heavy in his hand. But then, like a whisper carried on the wind, the lessons of his journey came rushing back to him. He thought of Lyra, standing resolutely at his side, her unwavering courage a mirror to his own. He remembered the sacrifices of those who had come before him, the stories etched into every step of this path. Power gained through deceit, he realized, was no power at all. It was a trap, a gilded cage. "No," Kael said, his voice steady despite the storm within him. "I will not trade my soul for your lies." The Shadow King's image wavered, his features twisting into a snarl of fury before dissolving into nothingness. The vision was gone, but its echo lingered, a stark reminder of the stakes at hand. With the Shadow King's presence banished, Kael and Lyra pressed on, their resolve hardened. The entrance to the tomb stood before them now, a massive stone archway carved with ancient symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the relic's light. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, as if the very earth held its breath. Together, they stepped across the threshold, leaving the wraiths and the Mesa behind. What lay ahead was unknown, but one thing was certain. The true test of their journey was just beginning. The air inside the tomb was heavy, thick with the scent of ancient dust, and something else, something electric, like the charged stillness before a storm. Kael and Lyra moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone walls. Every step felt deliberate, as if the tomb itself was watching, waiting to test them. Ahead, the corridor narrowed, its walls carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift in the flickering torchlight. It was as though the tomb was alive, breathing, and guiding them deeper into its heart. Kael's hand trembled as another vision gripped him, flashes of towering cities rising under golden suns, only to crumble into ash and shadow. He saw armies marching, empires sprawling across the sands, and then nothing, silence, emptiness. The visions were no longer fragments. They were a flood, pulling him into the past. He could almost hear the voices of those who had come before, whispering warnings, urging him to see the truth. The Shadow King's return wasn't just a threat. It was the unraveling of everything. The cost of his resurrection would be more than lives. It would be the very fabric of time, the stories of the ancients erased forever. Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. "Kael, focus. We're close." She pointed to a faint glow ahead, and as they approached, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. At its center stood a massive crystal, pulsating with an otherworldly light. Inside it, the final shard. The air around the crystal seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy that made Kael's skin prickle. This was it, the last piece of the puzzle, the key to stopping the Shadow King. But the tomb wasn't going to let them take it without a fight. The moment Kael's fingers brushed the crystal, the chamber shuddered. The ground beneath them cracked, and the walls began to groan, stone grinding against stone. The tomb was collapsing, its ancient defenses triggered by the removal of the shard. Dust rained from above as chunks of the ceiling started to fall. Lyra grabbed Kael's arm, pulling him toward the exit. "We have to move. Now." They sprinted through the crumbling corridors, dodging falling debris and leaping over widening gaps in the floor. The tomb was alive with chaos, its once silent halls now roaring with the sound of destruction. Kael clutched the shard tightly, its energy surging through him, feeding his determination. He couldn't fail, not now, not when they were so close. The visions had shown him what was at stake, and he wouldn't let the Shadow King erase the legacy of the ancient empires. Not while he still had breath in his lungs. As they neared the entrance, the way ahead was blocked by a cascade of fallen stones. Lyra didn't hesitate. She hurled a small vial to the ground, and with a flash of light, the rubble disintegrated into dust. "Go," she shouted, shoving Kael forward. They burst out of the tomb just as the entrance collapsed behind them, sealing the ancient secrets within. For a moment, they stood in silence, catching their breath as the dust settled around them. The final shard was in their hands, but the weight of what lay ahead was heavier than ever. Kael looked at Lyra, his expression grim but resolute. They had survived the tomb, but the true battle was yet to come, and they would face it together. Kael and Lyra stumbled out of the ancient tomb, the weight of their discovery heavy in their hands. The air around them shifted, growing colder and darker as shadows began to twist and writhe. From the dunes, the sand wraiths emerged, their forms swirling like living storms of dust and malice. At their head stood the Shadow King, his presence a suffocating wave of dread. His eyes, burning with a cold, otherworldly light, locked onto Kael, and in that moment, Kael knew there was no escape, only confrontation. Lyra gripped his arm, her voice urgent. The shards, they're our only hope. If we can restore the celestial mirror, its power might be enough to stop him. Kael nodded, his mind racing. The fragments of the mirror felt alive in his hands, humming with a faint, ancient energy. But Lyra's warning echoed in his mind. Kael, this is dangerous. The mirror's power hasn't been wielded in centuries. We don't even know if it will respond to us, or worse, what it might demand in return. Kael met her gaze, the resolve in his eyes unshakable. It's our only chance. If we don't try, everything we've fought for, everything we've lost, will mean nothing. As he began to piece the shards together, the air around him seemed to shimmer, a faint glow emanating from the fragments. But before he could complete the mirror, the Shadow King struck. A blast of dark energy surged toward them, and Kael barely had time to raise his sword, deflecting the attack with a spray of sparks. The force of the blow sent him skidding backward, his boots digging into the sand. The Shadow King advanced, his voice a low, echoing growl. You cannot outrun fate, Kael. The power of the mirror belongs to me. Kael gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on both his sword and the shards. He had to buy time. With a roar, he charged, his blade clashing against the Shadow King's shadowy weapon. The battle was fierce, each strike reverberating through the air as the desert itself seemed to tremble. Sand whipped around them, the wraiths circling like vultures, waiting for their chance to strike. Kael fought with everything he had, but the Shadow King's strength was overwhelming. Every blow felt like it might be his last. Sweat dripped down Kael's face as he parried another attack, his arms aching from the strain. He could feel the weight of exhaustion creeping in, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw Lyra working frantically to reassemble the mirror, her hands moving with desperate precision. The glow from the shards grew brighter, the air crackling with energy. Kael knew he had to hold the line, no matter the cost. The Shadow King's laughter echoed across the dunes, cold and mocking. You fight valiantly, but it is futile. You cannot win. Kael's response was a defiant swing of his sword, the blade slicing through the darkness. He didn't need to win. He just needed to buy enough time for the mirror to awaken. And as the glow from the shards intensified, Kael felt a surge of hope. The celestial mirror was almost complete, but so too was the Shadow King's patience. The final clash was coming, and Kael would need every ounce of strength to see it through. As Kael held the celestial mirror in his hands, its surface shimmered with an otherworldly glow, each fragment of its ancient design now whole and pulsating with power. The air around him seemed to hum, charged with the energy of countless generations who had dreamed of this moment. Before him stood the Shadow King, his form a swirling mass of darkness, his voice a low, menacing growl that echoed through the ruins. The time had come, the moment of reckoning. The mirror's light pierced through the Shadow King's veil, revealing the truth of his tyranny and the suffering he had inflicted upon the ancient empires. Kael could see it all, the shattered kingdoms, the broken lives, the sand stained with sorrow. The mirror's power surged within him, offering a choice, one that would shape not just his fate, but the destiny of all who would come after. He could unleash its full force, destroying the Shadow King once and for all, but the risk was immense. The mirror's energy might awaken the Shadow King's true strength, unleashing a darkness far worse than anything the world had ever known. Or Kael could shatter the mirror, banishing the Shadow King to the void forever. It would mean sacrificing the chance to restore the ancient kingdoms, to bring back the glory of the past. But it would also mean protecting the future, ensuring that no one else would suffer under the Shadow King's rule. Kael's heart weighed heavy with the enormity of the decision. He thought of the people who had trusted him, the stories of the past that had guided him, and the hope of those who dreamed of a better tomorrow. In the end, it wasn't just about the empires that had fallen, it was about the world that could still rise. With a deep breath, Kael raised the mirror high above his head. The light flared, brighter than the sun, and with a single, decisive motion, he brought it down. The mirror shattered, its pieces scattering like stars across the sands. A deafening silence followed, and then nothing. The Shadow King let out a final, anguished cry as he was pulled into the void, his form dissolving into the wind. The sand wraiths, bound to his will, crumbled into dust, their whispers fading into silence. The sand settled, and the ruins stood quiet once more. Kael stood alone, the weight of his choice settling on his shoulders. The past was gone, but the future was his to shape, and though the mirror was lost, its light still lingered, not in the shards scattered across the desert, but in the hope that Kael carried forward. The ancient empires were no more, but their legacy lived on in him, and in the promise of a world that could rise from the ashes. Kael and Lyra stood once more at the edge of the desert, the vast expanse of golden dunes stretching endlessly before them. The journey they had undertaken had left its mark on their hearts and minds, a transformation born of trials and revelations. The ancient empires they had encountered, now mere echoes in the sands, had imparted wisdom that would shape their paths forever. Kael gazed at the horizon, his thoughts heavy with the weight of all he had lost and all he had gained, the sacrifices he had made. His courage, his doubts, even parts of himself, had forged a resilience he never knew he possessed. He had faced the darkness within and emerged stronger, not just for himself, but for the world he now understood more deeply. Lyra, too, carried the weight of their journey, but hers was a burden of purpose. She ran her fingers over the weathered scrolls and artifacts she had gathered, treasures of knowledge that would now guide her life's work. The stories of the mystic sands, the rise and fall of empires, the dreams of kings and mystics. They were not just tales to be told, but lessons to be lived. She vowed to preserve these stories, to ensure that the wisdom of the ancients would never fade into obscurity. For her, the desert was not just a place of endings, but a wellspring of beginnings, where the past whispered its secrets to those who would listen. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dunes, Kael and Lyra prepared to part ways. Their bond, forged in the fires of shared struggle, would endure even as their paths diverged. Kael turned to her, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "The sands will always bring us back," he said, a quiet promise in his words. Lyra nodded, her eyes reflecting the same unspoken understanding. Together, they had walked through the heart of history, and though their journey had ended, its echoes would guide them forward. Kael lingered for a moment as Lyra set off toward the horizon, her figure soon blending with the shifting sands. He turned his gaze back to the desert, the wind carrying whispers of secrets long buried. The dreams of the ancient empires, once lost to time, now lived within him. They were not just memories but a compass, pointing him toward a future shaped by the wisdom of the past. The world, scarred and weary, began to heal one grain of sand at a time. And in the stillness of the desert, Kael knew that the journey was never truly over. It was only just beginning.